Do you want to tell us a little bit about this particular room and some works in this room? And you'll lead us through, and we'll meet some friends.
Sure, indeed. So most of the house is hung with female abstract expressionists. So every picture on the wall that you'll see today is by a female artist.
Right.
And they're either abstract portraits or they're pure abstraction. So the abstract expressionist period runs from basically the sort of mid-1940s when it's in its development through to really the early 1960s. So the movement is launched in 1951 by Leo Castelli's first show in America, the 9th Street Show. So we can talk a bit more about that as we walk around. So the artists that normally spring to mind when we talk about abstract expressionism are Franz Kline, Elaine de Kooning, Jackson Pollock, Mark Rothko. But of course, there was a huge movement in the women artists at the same time painting alongside them. Some of them were intermarried. Lee Krasner was married to Jackson Pollock, for example. Willem and Elaine de Kooning. Dorothy Denner, the sculptor, was married to David Smith. And Pat Passlof was married to Milton Resnick. Helen Frankenthaler was married to Robert Motherwell, etc., etc.
But they were women artists in their own right. It wasn't just that they were in some way emulating their husbands. I mean, it was really a movement of...
Absolutely. In fact, the only reason that a lot of them ended up marrying their male sort of colleagues was because they were showing at the same galleries, being looked at by the same art critics. They were going to the same bars and socializing. So naturally, a lot of them ended up dating and therefore, getting married. So it had absolutely nothing to do with one following the other. They were just in the same social scene and the same art scene. So that just would happen in any kind of business for that matter. So
Right. Chris, let's look at some works, and I'll ask Francesco, our film person, if he can try and give our guests a view of what we're seeing. But do you want to start here?
Sure. So mostly the movement was in New York, almost entirely, although there was an abstract expressionist movement in the 50s as well that was based on the West Coast, largely in the Bay Area. So in my office here in the house, I have the artists associated with the West Coast. This is by an artist called Emiko Nakano. It's 1957, who was a significant artist on the West Coast during the 1950s. Subsequently, though, she sort of changes sort of her life path in the 1960s, I think, gets married, has children, sort of leaves the art world behind a little bit. But
this
her 50s,
is the dilemma you often see, no?
This was often the reason also why some of the female artists sort of ended up, changing direction in life in general.
Right. And she was a Japanese American.
She was Japanese American, Emiko Nakano. Above this picture, we have two pictures painted right at sort of the perfect moment in abstract expressionism, 1951, the year of the 9th Street Show. The painting on the left is by Lily Fenichel, and the painting on the right is by an incredibly important artist of that period, Deborah Remington, and it's a 1951 picture by her.
So we're here, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
The picture on the top right, this is called Eleusian. There was a show at the Denver Museum of Art in 2016 of female abstract expressionists, which is really kind of one of the shows in recent years, probably the key show in recent years that has kind of kick-started the interest again in the female abstract expressionists. And since then, there's been a sort of momentum building in sort of researching these artists again and showing these artists again, which is now just sort of exploding.
Okay, so let's just fix that data, right?
Yeah.
So 2016.
Yeah.
Denver show.
Yeah.
Was a seminal show.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah. That's right, for the movement as a whole.
Right.
Having said that, since the 1950s, there's been dozens and dozens of museum shows surrounding these artists. In fact, Elaine de Kooning, we'll see in a second, had a major retrospective that went to 5 US museums in the early 90s, and then had a major retrospective of her portraits at the National Portrait Gallery in Washington in 2015. And yet still doesn't really have any major gallery representation, which is absolutely extraordinary.
It begs the question as to why, though, Chris, which you're going to answer, right, as we walk around.
Absolutely. These two paintings are both by Sonia Geshtov. They're around 1958, 1959. The one on the left is called The Map, and that's an important picture because it's one of the pictures that represented America in the first Paris Biennale in 1959. So she had two pictures representing America. It has a MoMA sticker on the back because the curators from MoMA chose the pictures to represent America. And so this is one of them.
And this representation in the Biennale for women, because it was around that time, starting from the 40s, that America started to sort of conquer the Biennale, on some level.
That's right. And I mean, what's interesting is it was perfectly normal for a female artist to represent America. We have a painting, again, actually by Elaine de Kooning in the hallway, that was shown in Japan in one of the sort of CIA-backed art tours of American art that was sort of touring the world,
right.
Which was trying to sort of promote America after the war using a sort of artistic medium of exhibitions.
Yeah.
And of course, many of the major artists of the period were women, many of the major collectors of the period were women, and actually many of the major gallerists of the period were women. Peggy Guggenheim had a gallery in New York until 1947. We'll talk later about Betty Parsons, one of the biggest galleries of sort of the 40s, 50s, 60s.
We call them influencers.
Indeed.
Right,
they were actually very, very key to kick-starting the movement. I mean, absolutely imperative.
Certainly when, I mean, I think that's always been the case historically of women patrons on some level wanting to promote women artists, starting from the 1600s, really.
So it's absolutely.
It's nothing new, but I think important to mention because, as women enter into the art scene, they not only enter as artists, but they enter as supporters, as patrons, as commissioners, as gallery owners, etc., collectors. And this is the twin, right?
Yes, so this is also by Sonia Geshtov. This one's called The Queen. Below it are two sculptures by Claire Falkenstein, a major sculptor on the West Coast during this period. The piece on the left is early 1940s.
So are we looking, just so that Francisco also knows which one we're looking at these fun...
That's right,
okay.
Yeah. And this is fairly typical of her work, where she would take sort of pieces of copper or steel and then weld them together in these kind of sort of interesting sculptural meshes.
Chris, can you repeat the date for us?
Well, this one's sort of mid-1940s on the left.
This one back here is 1940s. Okay.
And then the piece on the right here is around 1960.
Okay.
Actually, this is a sort of long chain made up of blue, aluminium, white, and yellow links. And then you sort of pile it up how you want to sort of show it yourself. I'm clearly not very good at piling it up and showing it because when I first saw it, it looked amazing, and now I've got it piled in a bit of a heap. So,
but it's, I mean, what a responsibility, right? You have to pile it up yourself.
I was fiddling about with this for about 40 minutes, and I just was sort of going nowhere with it. It's something I've got to spend like a couple of hours trying to get it right.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Or get somebody else to do it who actually knows how to produce a piece of art might be a better idea.
But I think it's interesting to sort of compare the years because you're looking at a generation of difference.
Yeah, this is quite poppy when you look at the colours and the sort of the idea and the composition.
There's a renewal. We're feeling more optimistic with this piece. Besides your pile, right?
Yeah.
Why don't you lead us through? I know that there's a picture over here.
So this is the 1966 work by Bernice Bings. Just sticking with her. Actually, her nickname was Bingo. She was known as on the West Coast. Even though this is quite figurative. You see the swimmer in the water, and you see a kind of skyline, a landscape, and then you've got the water kind of bursting up against this sort of rock almost from underneath the sea. Clearly, I guess, you do see that intense colour there of Diebenkorn, Thibaut in this being painting. So actually, now we think about it, it looks very much like a West Coast painting when you think of those two artists as well. And that is quite different to New York. So.
Well, I think there's a lot of, in this painting, a lot is happening because you have such a calm sort of surface, and then in the front of the painting, it's almost like this, whirlwind of energy.
Yeah.
That doesn't match the water up above. There's a little bit of foreboding, there. But the yellow makes us feel better, doesn't it?
Well, very California, definitely.
Yeah. Okay, so I really am interested in what's going to happen in the next room.
Okay.
And why don't we just let the camera have a look? And you can take your time, Francesco, in showing this particular monumental piece. And I know, Chris, there's a lot to say about this painting, so we're all ears in terms of what we're looking at here.
Sure. So one of the major painters of abstract expressionism was Elaine de Kooning, who married Willem de Kooning in 1943. So as well as painting pure abstract expressionist paintings, pure abstraction, she also was interested in abstract portraiture. She starts painting abstract portraits in the mid-1940s and continues them throughout her career. If you don't see the head or even the feet within a largish sort of square, you can really see how abstract the picture is.
Definitely. And that's a little game that they played, no? And she particularly, because she's using figurative.
Yeah.
But, certainly, you see her exploring abstractionism here, for example.
Completely. In this area here, you've got someone sitting down, you've got knees, legs, trousers, hands.
Yeah.
And yet, if all you saw was that piece in a picture, you would have no idea, that it was two people sitting down, but you couldn't see their heads.
Yes.
It's pure abstraction.
Yes, exactly.
And yet there's a bottom half of two whole figures in that one area.
So what is Elaine de Kooning doing here socially? Because this is a group, and the title of the painting, you want to tell us a little about the title and who she's representing?
It's possibly her most famous picture, actually, other than the JFK series that she does that we'll talk about in a moment. The other interesting thing about it is that there's all sorts of Dutch connotations to it, because it's called the Burgers of Amsterdam Avenue. Amsterdam Avenue runs up into Haarlem. She's Elaine de Kooning. Willem de Kooning is Dutch.
Right.
And she wants to set it out like a sort of, like a Dutch sort of portrait, multi-figure portrait, like the Night Watch, or like a sort of early sort of Dutch or Flemish family scene, Rembrandt-esque. And so she's married a Dutchman. Amsterdam Avenue runs into Haarlem. It's and it's set out like an early 17th century Dutch sort of portrait. So the other thing, sticking with the sort of the drug addiction issue, is that she wanted this to be a major sort of political picture.
Right.
Clearly, the intention was to draw attention to this terrible plight of drug addiction amongst young people in New York in the early 60s. This was painted in 1963. It was the perfect year to paint a picture that she wanted to make a sort of political splurge, because it was also the year that she was painting the president JFK.
Okay.
So if we move on to this picture,
I just
here.
want to say one detail about this painting, because I think it's just fascinating. De Kooning at one point wasn't allowed to take the painting home, because the director of the center, if I'm not mistaken, said, it's for privacy issues, you can't take it away from the center. And so she actually ended up painting over with acrylic paints the faces of the characters. And then as soon as she got home, she restored the painting,
and
removed the acrylic.
Yeah.
Well, no, she just took the acrylic paint off.
Yeah.
And then, exhibited as she saw fit, etc. But this was a little sort of trick.
I see, yeah. So she painted over them and then removed the overpaint.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, it was the perfect time to paint something that she wanted to make a sort of political statement with in 1963, because in 1962 she'd been given a commission by the Truman Library in Missouri to paint a picture of the president, JFK.
Right.
So she sits with him in December 62 and January 63. And during 1963, apart from painting the burghers of Amsterdam Avenue, she pretty much spends the whole year painting paintings of JFK.
Right.
Of which this is one. He's then assassinated in the November 63, and seeing as she's been so focused on this commission, she then goes into a sort of period of mourning, if you like, and doesn't really paint much in 1964, and then finally delivers the original commission to the Truman Library in February 1965. So almost 3 years after it was the original commission.
Yeah.
This is the original 1964 magazine. And this is another version that she painted in 63. So I think this is like the second or third largest one that she did. It's about 8 feet high, and it's also got him in this sort of wonderful pose, legs open, very casual, and yet he's the president,
Yeah. She was actually hired because she was famous for producing portraits in one sitting.
Yeah.
And she ended up working for years.
Yeah, on this one.
And she mentioned having to, on some level, take into consideration his public image as well, and the fact that he was photogenic and very overexposed. But I think this painting, shows how interested she was in gesture, and rather than face. And that's something you can tell us about when we look at the other portraits. But in the letter, in her acceptance letter to be chosen as the portraitist, I remember the quote was, Elaine de Kooning is a painter suitable to the president.
Oh, right.
Which I love. I love that.
Excellent.
That idea. What are we seeing here, Chris?
Well, actually, I own a number of Elaine de Kooning portraits, which are tremendously important. In fact, she had a show at the National Portrait Gallery in Washington in 2015, a major retrospective of her portraits. This is earlier. This is 1954. So this is the time when Willem de Kooning is probably painting his most important female pictures as well. And I like this picture intensely because I just find the abstraction and the brushstrokes just completely wild, and it's an unbelievably masterfully painted picture. Again, take away the head and the feet and you would have no idea that this was a portrait from any distance.
Yeah.
It really is only when you see the head and the feet on top of this and stand back that you see it's a portrait.
Yeah, that point's really clear here.
Yeah, the brushed work, the layering is really just extraordinary. I think this is just an amazing, amazing picture. And just touching on the faces, the reason that she didn't paint the details of the faces was that she always said that she felt that you learned more about a person from their posture, the way that they carried themselves. And she really wants to try and sort of bring that through in a portrait rather than just painting a portrait of someone, because when you look at a normal portrait of someone, the first thing you do is look at the face and the expression on the face.
Yes.
So she wanted to do the opposite, so you just look at this sort of mass of colour and the general sort of feeling of the person and the general sort of position of the person. So this painting's later, so we see a number of actually more contemporary pictures around the house. So they're mostly abstract expressionists, 40s to 60s, but some of them are a little bit later.
Yeah.
But I just want to talk about this because it's an important picture. It's 1972. It's by an African-American artist called Howardina Pindell. She, I believe, was the first African-American female curator of a major US museum. And she was a curator in the prints and drawings department at MoMA from 1967 to 1977. She did a series of paintings around this time, around 1972. So they're probably her most famous works. And she punched a hole or holes into pieces of card,
right,
and then sort of spray or dapple painted through the holes. So it's basically made up of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dots. And so it has this lovely kind of sort of shimmering feeling to it. So she's one of the most important African-American painters of the 20th century. And sculptors, actually, and she's still alive and well, and still working, actually. So not only the 20th century, but the 21st too.
Right.
And I just love this work, and I think this is the largest one that she did of that series. And
I wonder if the camera can get, because you see there's a lot of movement in it actually with this technique that you're talking about. And was she the inventor of this technique, or was it something that was being used?
Well, it's kind of a sort of a pointillism of sorts, I suppose. Yeah. Although to do it through card rather than doing it with a paintbrush could be a sort of, I guess, a unique and pioneering sort of idea at the time. So I guess stenciling wasn't a new technique, but the idea of making one of these works purely of dots is really, really extraordinary. It's actually the kind of work that when you see it in a PDF, it just looks like a black square. Yeah. It's the kind of work you really have to see live to really appreciate it.
It's true. Towards the corner, you can see more, possibly on camera.
Yeah, well, you can see the background is sort of a deep red, but then it shimmers with this sort of navy blue and black and different sort of dark blue sort of shimmerings. So it's got this kind of like lovely sort of crimson and a navy sort of flow to it.
It's a very meditative painting because the more you look at it, the more you see.
Yeah. It's really an amazing piece.
I wish we had more time because there's so many pieces beyond the abstractionists that really, are worth talking about and worth looking at. And but I wanted to ask you, and we'll get on this side here. We've just looked at the de Koonings and the Kennedy and the Burgers of Amsterdam Avenue, but we have some more portraits as well.
We
by
do.
De Kooning.
We do.
But do you want to just say a couple of words about this painting? Because I know it has a story.
This has a bit of a story. So this is by an artist called Amaranth Ehrenhout, who is probably just slightly later than many of the others. It's called Jump In and Move Around, and it's 1962. And it's a billion colours in this picture, as one can see. It's really, really spectacular. So it was painted in 1962, and it went straight into an exhibition in Paris, a multi-artist exhibition. The exhibition was written up by a chap called John Ashbery in the Herald Tribune at the time. So he says lovely things about the exhibition, and he particularly picks out this painting and says that it's one of the great pictures in the exhibition. So several weeks or months later, Amaranth Ehrenhout runs into him, I think at a gallery opening or something, and goes up to him. This is according to Amaranth Ehrenhout, and an interview with her, and says to him, thank you, it's so amazing what you wrote, and thanks for the great write-up. And he turns around to her and says, "Oh, Amaranth," he said, "I thought you were a man. If I'd have known you were a woman, I wouldn't have painted it. I wouldn't have written that." But
Why? Because he would have been taking making a stand, or
well, it's an extraordinary thing, isn't it? Really, I mean, I mean, getting back to the point about why did so many of them disappear, other than maybe Lee Krasner and Joe Mitchell? And actually, although having said that, even a sculptor like Dorothy Denner had a retrospective at the Jewish Museum in New York in 1965, and another one at the Cleveland Museum of Art in 1993.
Right.
And yeah, if you said Dorothy, everyone knows David Smith, nobody has a clue who Dorothy Denner is hardly, but they should do. Part of it, I think, is probably because when you look at the art history books that were written in the late 20th century, whether they're about abstract expressionism or about generalist art history,
right,
women are almost entirely, if not entirely in some cases, without naming the authors, completely written out of them.
Right.
So I guess when students are studying art history, or you pick up a book on abstract expressionism up until recently, or you pick up a book on the history of art, there's almost no women artists in it, or they're completely written out of it.
Right.
So there seems to be this period where, even though there was, women artists have operated hugely in the mid to late 20th century, we could all name, a dozen of them, but somewhere along the line, an overly large amount of them have just got sort of lost in the works.
Right.
The only thing that I can think of for that, because plenty of women have been gallerists throughout time, and plenty of women collect. I mean, often it's the women that are collectors, while and their husbands, are running their companies and traveling around the world and this kind of thing. And not that their wives don't run businesses and run lives and whatever, but often it's the wives that collect definitely as much as the men. Right. So the only thing that seems to be outstanding to me is that they've been written out of They were written out of the history books in the late 20th century for about 30 or 40 years or so. And that seems to be the outstanding thing. Although, having said that, less women were painting in general. So, I mean, in the 9th Street show in 1951, there was 11 female artists, but there was 75 artists in the show overall. So there was definitely less opportunity for women in society. And then you get into the legal reasons for that. So, which of course Justice Ruth Ginsburg, who became the first female member of the Supreme Court, was actively changing this from the sort of the late 60s onwards, and did all this sort of great work. But what seemed to be happening is that there was numerous laws in America that were kind of sort of there to cajole women to stay at home, and also a number of laws that tried to sort of force men out to work. And the idea was to protect the family unit. Right. But by doing that, of course, it suppressed women's ability to work. So, society-wise, not many of them were then just going off and becoming artists. Some did, but it would have been the minority.
But I think an interesting point that we can take from this whole discussion too is that critics had played such a fundamental role in making artists in general and women artists memorable, and that's true today as well. It's not just the art production, but it's who's talking about the art, who's collecting the art, etc., and the documentation of it, whether it's through shows or whether it's through catalogs, etc. It's very essential that we start talking or continue talking now, because I imagine since you started collecting a few years ago, was it 2008 that you started collecting?
Well, I've been collecting for 27 years now, since I was 25, in different areas, and I've jumped around over the years. And the museum, which we opened in 2011, is Roman, Greek and Egyptian antiquities shown alongside artworks from the 16th century to today, which have classical themes. But I started collecting purely post-war, actually about 8 years ago, and I was collecting male and female artists. So I wasn't particularly discriminating between the two, but then the more research I did, the more interesting the female side just became. I mean, there's a trend in collecting female artists in general at the moment, and multicultural artists and things, and everyone's trying to correct the fact that the media worked out 10 years ago that 95% of artworks on museum walls were by white male artists.
Right.
But there was a slightly different path for me. I was collecting male and female post-war artists, which was a conscious decision that I made about 8 years ago. So I bought sort of Joe Mitchell, Helen Frankenthaler, Lee Krasner, but I also bought, you know, David Smith, Basquiat, Keith Haring, Wayne Thiebaud, and I just bought pictures that I thought were sort of masterpieces. But then I sort of bought the Denver catalogue, and I bought Elaine de Kooning's portraits catalogue, and then the book 9th Street Women came out, so then I got really interested in Grace Hartigan and Elaine de Kooning, and then I just sort of got interested in the whole area and just thought that, wow, this is a whole area of underappreciated artists that should just all be brought back to the fore. And there were so many works on the market at the time by these amazing artists that had been shown in Betty Parsons back in the 50s, or had been in sort of major museum shows, and they were on the market for not, relatively speaking, so much money.
Mm-hmm. Has that changed? We'll continue up the stairs, but just it's an interesting discussion in terms of collecting. You know, if you've seen a change in recent years as the popularity of collectionism. It's changing all the time. So, I mean, this is a more appreciated area now, for sure, and people are getting to grips with Elaine de Kooning, Grace Hartigan, and the other artists who are major artists at the time. Perle Fine, Mary Abbott, Ethel Schwarbacker, Pat Passlof, Judith Godwin, so you know, it's definitely percolating now, and the prices are moving quite sharply. Chris, I wanted to move us along a little
sure.
bit, and if the camera can just get these two portraits of Elaine de Kooning, which are separated by a generation. You just want to tell us really quickly about them?
So just super quick, this is actually a very early portrait by her. This is 1944. So this is the year after they've got married, and at this point she's 26 years old. And this is 1965, so 21 years later. So here she's 47, and just starting to sort of paint again, following the sort of the JFK situation in 63 and 64, and starting to feel the trials of life you feel in her face in that picture. Yeah.
I love the one from the 60s particularly.
So here we have a painting called Black Pagoda, as one can see why, painted in 1959. It was in a show at the Betty Parsons Gallery in 1959. It's by the artist Judith Godwin, who was actively showing from the early to mid-50s. Below it, we have a 1959 bronze bull from one of Elaine de Kooning's, one of only a handful of sculptures that she ever did. It's a unique piece, and really, it's an amazing piece of work, this, because you really see, actually it weighs about 12 kilos.
Oh my gosh.
You really see it almost looks like a leather hide in the work, and the bull is kind of like big-shouldered and charging away. It's really an amazing sculpture by her. Yeah, absolutely. It's solid.
Wow.
Yeah, you can still see all the.
So I wanted to ask our guests to remember this bull, because we're soon going to see a bullfight
painting.
Yeah. Okay, so keep this in your minds.
Well, on the Betty Parsons theme, maybe we'll take a look at a Betty Parsons picture. So, as well as being one of the major gallerists of the period, she was also a painter and a sculptor herself, actually. So this is a 1957 work by her, looking out. Brilliant use of colour. Yeah. I mean, the blue is absolutely spectacular, and this slightly mustardy sort of yellow is really lovely. And then on occasion, she would sort of inscribe these sort of designs into a picture. I'm not too sure whether she just used the back of the paintbrush and span it around, or whether she did it using some kind of implement. But her pictures are really, really stunning, and she's really an amazing colorist.
And did she continue painting for a long while, or did she have a period in which she painted?
I think she painted throughout her career, actually. Her sculptures are actually pretty interesting as well. But the paintings, I just think, are spectacular.
They're beautiful.
Yeah.
They're beautiful. But she's one of the influencers that we've been talking about over the course of the talk, of choosing women, perhaps, and
absolutely
displaying them.
Yeah, I mean, she had a good roster of women artists. Although she did famously say once something along the lines of I prefer showing the males because I sell the males more easily. I think that goes along the lines of the Amaranth Ehrenhaut situation, that unfortunately, there was this, I guess, terrible sort of social thing at the time, which was a legacy thing throughout history of that, you wanted something by a male rather than a female. But it's good that society now and the art market for this period is now starting to correct that. Yeah. But when you look at the prices, of course, there's a long way to go, and that's not to say that they will even up completely. But clearly the whole area is just massively underappreciated, and that's just changing rapidly now. But it's still just sort of in the early throes of that. It's really. We talk about the Denver show as being a seminal show, and it's only 6 years ago.
Exactly.
And it's, although there's a huge number of shows now occurring, bringing these artists along.
And are some of your babies participating in these shows?
Yeah. So we've got several works on loan in Berlin right now, and then actually there's a Frankenthaler exhibition right now in Krems in Austria that we've also loaned to. So all our 4 Frankenthaler paintings are away. Then we're loaning, I think, 15 works. Myself and actually my brother owns several of these pictures as well, to the Albertina Museum in Vienna. And then I have some works going to Oslo. And then I have about 40 works in the Whitechapel Gallery museum tour that goes to France and then goes to Germany. So that's... I forget how many paintings are in. I mean, it's well over 100 pictures, of course, in the show, but this collection makes up a bit of a spine of that show, as it were.
So for our guests, they have some places to go, some cities to visit, right?
Absolutely,
to see parts of your collection.
Yeah. There's a huge amount going on. In fact, the Artisan Museum in Japan is having a show next year, which also includes a lot of these artists. They're a major museum in Tokyo as well, and they've been collecting in this area.
It's all great news.
Yeah, and I think there's 1 or 2 things that are percolating in the US for 2024, 25 and 26 too. So a lot of museum shows coming up, which is also good for the space, of course.
Yeah, definitely. So here we are at Perle Fine.
Yeah, so Perle Fine was in the 9th Street show. She had her first show at the Willard Gallery in New York in 1945. This is a 1954 picture by her.
Okay.
Called, which we've recently found out, actually, it was, or is called, Lacerated Yellows. Now, we felt that there is always a bit of Mondrian in this, because it seems to be a sort of abstract tabletop, but it's absolutely clear that the painting is cut into maybe Mondrian-esque type squares. Exactly. This being a sort of lattice of yellow lines as well, you can see how her friendship with Pierre Mondrian in the early 40s has come through in this 1954 picture. It's absolutely unmistakable.
But Chris, the fact that before it was untitled and now it's lacerated yellow, lacerated yellow, it's quite a statement, right? Did it change how you feel about the picture, or?
Well, it made that greater connection between her and Mondrian. I mean, at first it just seemed like it was a picture that she cut into squares, but was otherwise a largely abstract picture. The fact that it was then called Lacerated Yellows then reminded me of this sort of lattice style of painting where Mondrian goes from sort of the big squares, mostly in white, with maybe one red, one blue, to this painting, 1942, quite a famous picture by him, that's a lattice of yellow lines. So then the lacerated yellow just made me think of that lattice network of yellow lines, and then Mondrian's painting of 42 just completely is directly reflected in this 1954 painting by Perle Fine, who has such, this close sort of connection with him.
Chris, we're in the chocolate room.
Oh, we are?
Yes, which is such a nice name for a room. I think we should spend a long time in here.
Well, the last time we met, we had a massive 3-meter high, 2-meter wide Helen Frankenthaler here, which is now in Berlin, in Potsdam, in the Barberini Museum there. So here we have Passlof. This is 1958, and she studied under Elaine de Kooning in the late 1940s under Black Mountain College. Moved to New York, very much became part of the scene, was constantly friendly with the de Koonings. And then later in the 1950s married the abstract artist Milton Resnick. So it was another sort of artist sort of marriage, if you like, although both Milton Resnick and Passlof were long established artists on the scene before they got married in the late 1950s. So oddly enough, this painting is called Promenade for a Bachelor. So
do you know why?
I don't, actually, and one can maybe imagine that this is a sort of a couple promenading and walking along a broad walk or something. Maybe this is some kind of foliage, as it's green, going on over here. Yeah. And however you can pick out one or two people in this sort of centre of the picture, one can sort of have a few thoughts. But I actually think that Passlof is just such an incredible artist, and use of colour, depth of colour, and just the composition overall is just spectacular. And they're always lively, happy, stunningly beautiful pictures. She really is an extraordinary artist.
She does a lot of layering, and it's quite plastic almost, in the sense, almost sculptural, in some parts.
Yeah, tremendously heavy impasto around here, really all over the painting. It's again, you'd have to sort of see it live, but tremendously thick paint, and just layer upon layer upon layer. So it's a gazillion colours.
It's nice when you say they're happy.
Yeah, I mean, I find Yvonne Thomas, who we'll talk about soon, and Passlof, tremendously happy pictures. They
lovely.
Really are.
That's lovely.
And actually, as is Miriam Shapiro, another great artist of the period, who starts developing her style in the mid to late 50s. This is a 1956 picture by her called Idol 2. And it was actually shown in a group show in MoMA in 1956, so which is obviously a nice provenance. Now, the last time we spoke, and it's actually been a good idea to sort of update our conversation as we've sort of discovered so much, myself and my sort of research team, about these pictures, new names and things. Now, we thought that this was a sort of tabletop scene with a sort of plainish background, and we thought this was sort of a water jug and various things going on. That's not the case at all. What we've now discovered is that this is a scene from a Charlie Chaplin movie.
Oh my.
And there's 3 figures in this picture. One over here, one in the middle, try and find that one, and one over on the far left-hand side. So much of like this area around here, and this, what we know now to be a figure over here, is just tremendously, vibrant and quite thickly painted. So it's really a beautiful picture.
It really is, and it actually speaks very nicely with the Pavlov, I have to say.
Yeah, and painted
It's
2 years
just
apart. You
yeah.
know, you could just feel the vibrancy of the 1950s. You know.
Yeah, there was a little bit of optimism happening in the 1950s. So
and then you have this vibrancy. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, another vibrant picture here above, actually, a 1977 unique piece by Louise Bourgeois. But above it,
in contrast,
we have another bright, beautiful, spectacular 50s picture. It's by Ethel Schwarbacher. It's 1956. I have a Cosmopolitan magazine from 1961 that bills her as one of the major female artists of the period. And she talks about, or the article talks about, a lot about Grace Hartigan and Elaine de Kooning, Helen Frankenthaler. And even though it's largely red, the red's been painted on top of sort of massive greens and oranges and blues and purples, and then they're kind of like interlaced together in some areas. This stunning sort of pink in the middle, and
it's a lot of freedom. A lot of freedom in it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, what do you see in this picture when you look at it?
That's what I see. Is freedom. There's freedom of movement, even of energy.
Yeah.
And I think that was maybe one of the most exciting things about the expressionist abstractionism. That they were suddenly not necessarily going by the quote unquote rules. It was very, the canvases were large. Color, and that color. I was thinking before of a quote by Perle Fine, and she said, "My paintings speak the only language I know, color."
Yeah.
And looking, being inside the chocolate room, that's what I'm thinking, is it was a language, a whole new language that they were discovering.
Yeah.
I'm going to push you in this direction because the loo is in that direction, and you have wonderful photos.
Okay, let's just have
so I'm just going to send you in there by yourself.
Yeah, I'll come in with a photographer actually, and
we can have.
It's not a habit of mine to draw people into the loo with me, generally speaking. It's
we'll have Francesca, the filmmaker, is following you in.
Yeah. But I've been collecting photographs of the period actually, and which are tremendously interesting. So, and they really sort of bring back the time to you. So, some fantastic photographs of sort of Jackson Pollock, Lee Krasner. The one below it's an early picture of Elaine and Willem de Kooning by Ellen Auerbach. A portrait of her husband, Walter Auerbach, is downstairs that we took a look at. And then what's interesting is that they sort of show you the social scene of the period too. So, I mean, in particular, there's this great picture here. So the main tavern where a lot of the artists were hanging out was the Cedar Tavern or the Cedar Bar. This is in the Five Spot, which was another one of the sort of bars that they frequented. And in this one picture alone, you have David Smith, Helen Frankenthaler, Frank O'Hara, the poet Larry Rivers, Grace Hartigan, all there in 1957. And even what's kind of interesting is they've got a sort of board at the back with the Atelier Gallery having a show of someone or another. And so it's just amazing pieces of social history. And so I've really sort of enjoyed collecting the photographs as well. And there's a wonderful one here of Mitchell Frankenthaler and Krasner at a Frankenthaler opening. It's really quite a...
this is such a lovely one. I'm going to go to the other side of the painting over here. Okay. Ta-da!
So this is a 1977 Joan Mitchell. It's the best part of 3 meters high.
Yeah.
And I forget how wide, probably, 180 or something like that. So she has a sort of interesting story because, she's painting in New York through the 1950s. She's originally from Chicago, but she always had a sort of love affair with France from the late 40s onwards and was a regular sort of visitor to France. She then has an over 20-year relationship with the Canadian artist Jean-Paul Riopel, and they moved to Paris in 1959. By this time, 1977, they've moved out of Paris and are living in a village called Vertailles, which is next to Giverny, where Monet lived in the later years of his life and painted his famous water lily pictures. So she did a series of pictures throughout this time in the sort of late 1970s that are sort of Monet water lily-esque, of which this is one. And again, it's a picture that really needs to be seen live, because there's areas where the impasto is literally, I mean, a quarter of an inch thick all over it. It's really, really quite incredible. I mean, whole just lumps of paint here, and throughout the.
I feel like I have to get further away to be able to really see it.
Yeah, it's very water lily-esque. In fact, I went to the show in the Barberini Potsdam, Berlin, of this sort of post-war abstraction to see some of the paintings that we have on loan there, and. They have a permanent collection of Impressionism and have a lot of Monets in the collection, have sort of become famous for it.
Yeah, because it's such an interesting, I mean, even just that simple detail, that it was in some way responding to the water lilies, changes how you see it, how you look at it.
Absolutely.
This statue was from a similar area?
This is Ile-de-France, so yeah, a similar area in northern France. So,
yeah, I pointed out because I always like to see how the sculpture is talking to the paintings and what sort of connections they have. I mean, two pieces that you would say there is no relation, but geographically...
they're extremely close. Yeah. But it also shows you how, which is something that we do a lot in the museum in Mougins. We show the ancient versus the modern, and the pieces talk to each other, sort of perfectly. Although there we might show a 2,000-year-old Roman statue of Aphrodite next to like Yves Klein's Aphrodite, Dali's Aphrodite, and a drawing of the Venus de Milo by Cézanne. So like you've got all these like very direct comparisons.
Also, the blue works for the Madonna.
Yeah, it does.
For some reason. But we have two other very important pieces in this room.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask if you would talk to us just a little bit about the Grace Hartigan.
Yeah, so this is probably one of Grace Hartigan's most important pictures in private hands. And early 50s pictures are quite rare. What's absolutely fantastic about Grace Hartigan, apart from the fact that actually she was the most successful women artist of the 1950s, is that she wrote a daily diary from 1951 to 1955, where she talks about all the pictures that she's painting and what's happening in her daily life. And then you can see what she's thinking, about your painting as she's painting it. But this is the time, so early 50s, the art scene's really building, prices are going up, and people are buying more than they were sort of during the 1940s for an array of obvious reasons. And now they're all starting to make some money. So, and sometimes in the case of Pollock, who really kind of hit it big before anybody else, and maybe other than Robert Motherwell in sort of from around sort of 46, 47 onwards when he's starting his drip paintings. By 1952, 53, several more of them are now starting to have some money coming in from these gallery shows.
And she was one of them. She was one who was purchased by galleries at this time.
Absolutely. So she was represented by the Tibor Denage Gallery, which still exists in New York, and showed abstract expressionists both then and now. This is the time when she's painting under George Hartigan. So what's interesting is that when you see a Tibor Denage sort of gallery poster, it says George Hartigan on the top. She was signing the paintings just Hartigan, and she would turn up to the opening. So everybody would see that she wasn't a male, and she'd turn up as Grace Hartigan. And she is, at this point, the biggest female artist in New York and one of the biggest artists overall. In fact, her gallery shows were largely selling out.
she had a period.
You really want
Yeah.
50s Hartigans
Yeah.
or first half of the 1960s is really, and there's a huge price disparity there as well. I mean, like 10 times the price.
Right.
So the market accounts for that.
So it's recognized. It's recognized that that's her period.
That's for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, your favorite.
One of my favorite
One-
artists, a bit like Passlof, is
Yeah.
actually another one that's not so well known, although is really starting to move at auction now and get, you really sort of see her works heavily exhibited, and there's more sort of interest there. And that's Yvonne Thomas. So, and she was in the 9th Street show. She was one of the 11 women that was in this 75 artist show in 1951. Leo Castelli's first show in America, another one that goes on to become one of the biggest gallerists of the late 20th century. Tremendously important. She was in that show and exhibited heavily throughout the 1950s. And this is a 1956 work by her. And again, I just love her works. I mean, a bit like, Passlof, they're alive, vibrant, colorful.
It's very soothing too. I mean, although it's colorful, it's a quieter happiness than the other ones that we've looked at.
Yeah, I mean, Passlof is sort of, powerful, packs a punch.
Yeah.
I see what you say. You've got all this beautiful color. I mean, all these different types of sort of, pink. It's really in fuchsia sort of colors.
It's beautiful.
It's really sort of amazing. And yet at the same time, it's a much softer sort of feeling that you sort of get from it.
I just learned recently that hot pink was invented right around this time.
Oh,
by Elsa.
as an individual color.
Yeah, as an
Right,
individual
okay.
color in the fashion world.
Okay.
And so it's interesting that she's using a lot of pinks. We
Right.
could probably argue whether a color can be invented.
Actually, I mean, this is the emergence, I guess, the sort of late 50s, talking of Florence and fashion of the Pucci brand and the Pucci family, who are this amazing Renaissance family, still living in the same Renaissance palace here that they've lived in for 600 years.
Right.
And Emilio Pucci, I think, was developing that brand in the late 50s and 60s. And of course, they're noted for their extraordinarily beautiful and bright sort of color patterns.
In fact, it's interesting to look at this painting from a fashion point of view. It was probably also in conversation. Because Pucci does use a lot of these colors,
Absolutely. I mean, they're noted for their extremely bright and beautiful colors, Pucci. So that's really what the Pucci designs are all about. So certainly the thing that you sort of you remember Pucci for, amongst the fact that it's sort of amazing sort of design in itself.
Yes.
I can't describe a lady's dress quite as well as I can describe a painting.
I can imagine, and why would you? Okay, so here, this is another obviously beautiful room, and Francesco, when you come in, if you could give the whole sort of overview of the room so that our guests can have a look before we look at a couple of the paintings. And I know Passlof is one that we will be looking at.
Yeah. So, we talked a bit about her before. There's now a Passlof and Resnick Foundation in New York, which does exhibitions, etc. So that can be visited. This is another painting where we've discovered a little bit more about it. So we talked last time about, it's a 1959 Passlof. It's called Stove. And at first it just looks like a massive pale blue, which it is. But when you look at sort of, the background of the picture, you've got these millions and millions of sort of detailed reds, yellows, and oranges. It's very, very detailed and very, very heavily painted. So she does this hugely, hugely detailed abstract picture. Must have taken her forever. And then she paints over it sort of 80% in light blue. So it's called Stove. So as we sort of discussed before, This is seemingly an American stove. We think the light blue paint is the steam coming off the stove, and you've got the kind of red heat going on behind it.
Yeah, but I have to say, I mean, I can't imagine having done an entire painting and then covering it up. It really is an exercise in detachment, you know.
Well,
although she does a second layer above in this beautiful blue, but really, it's amazing.
Well, absolutely, because the thing is, when you look at it from a distance, you think it's basically a big blue painting.
Yeah.
So again, there's something about Yvonne Thomas and Pat Passlof that I just think is blockbuster.
Really fascinating.
Well, talking of blockbusters.
Talking of blockbusters, because it's a totally different place. We're in a totally different place with the bull.
Yeah.
With de Kooning.
So Elaine de Kooning visits these bullfights in Mexico around 1957-58, and then paints this one of her most famous series, the bullfight series, around that time, 58-59. And she does 3 or 4 of these, or 5 of these, which are like 4 meters wide, like the Burgers of Amsterdam Avenue is like 4.5 meters by about 180.
Where are they?
Well, one is in the permanent collection of the Denver Art Museum. One is in the Asom Museum in Tokyo, interestingly, and then there's either another 2 or 3, which may well be in museums or private hands. I'm not too sure.
Yeah.
It's a fantastic charging bull. You can almost even see this sort of spears and feathers sort of sticking out out of his sort of the back of his shoulders, and this sort of violent action. So here we are in the 1950s. It's 1959, and this is a time when Picasso in Europe is doing bullfight sort of pictures around the state. So, and of course everybody knew who Picasso was, and Picasso would visit New York, now and again. So it's interesting that you've got Elaine de Kooning doing bullfight pictures because she's been to Mexico and seen bullfights. And Picasso around the same time is having, his bullfight kind of fanaticism as well. So it's another kind of like interesting sort of connection.
Yeah. She said at one point that to her painting, or a painting, is a verb, not a noun. And I see it so strongly in this because it's a static bull, quote unquote, but in movement.
Oh, the movement's unbelievable.
It's amazing.
It's absolutely unbelievable. She painted movement tremendously.
We have Hartigan.
Yeah, well, we just mentioned this one. This is a 1951-52 picture by Audrey Flack called Abstract Force, Homage to Franz Klein, who she was friendly with. Of course, you see Franz Klein within this. And I just want to mention Audrey, actually, because I exchanged the odd email with Audrey. She's still alive. She's the only one of these artists that's still alive, still working and painting. She's in her mid-90s, and really is a fantastic person, giving TV interviews and all sorts of things. So she really is an amazing character, and this is her most famous picture. So. And again, phenomenal date, 51-52, emergence of the movement en masse, 9th Street show, amazing.
Well, there's a lot of movement happening, right, in the 50s, both in color and in actual movement, what you see. Beautiful. Well, we're going to have to send Audrey our conversation, the restoration conversation.
I guarantee you, Audrey Flack would love to see our conversation.
Yeah.
She would... well, I can't speak for Audrey Flack, but I'm sure she would love to see it.
We hope she will.
So, Grace Hartigan again, 1951. So we've produced a book of the collection, of the Abstract Expressionist side of the collection, 1940 to 1970s.
Congratulations.
Thank you. The 2 authors are Ellen Landau, who's a world-famous academic in this area, knew many of the artists personally, including Lee Krasner. She wrote Lee Krasner's catalogue raisonné in the 1990s, so she's basically the world's renowned expert on Lee Krasner. And also writing the book with her is Jo Marta, who's the editor-in-chief of the Women's Art Journal in America. She's the director of the Dorothy Denner Foundation, and is also a hugely leading academic in the area. And both Ellen and Joan have curated numerous shows and really have been there as sort of a powerhouse, sort of supporting the women. So to have those two people writing the book about my collection is an unbelievable honour, to say the least.
And the book is in pre-publication and it's coming out for the public?
Yeah, the book's just going through its sort of final edits, final colour proofing of the pictures, and it's now available on Amazon, can be pre-ordered on Amazon. It's called Abstract Expressionism, The Women. So
amen.
So type that in and it'll pop up on Amazon.com or Amazon.co.uk. I'm not sure if it's on the EU ones yet, but it's definitely on Amazon.com. So this is 1951. Again, absolutely perfect date. What can be better than that? This is called Cedar Bar and the Cedar Tavern. Cedar Bar was where so many of the artists used to hang out. Amazing.
We saw the photograph.
Yes, so the photograph of the Cedar Tavern in the Loo, and the Fife Spot as well, another sort of hangout of theirs. And but she talks about this painting in her diaries in 1951. It's just about the first painting that she mentions, and but in her diary she talks about it as being called Aries, which was Hartigan's star sign. And this is now the front cover of the Abstract Expressionists, the Women catalogue. So it's the front cover picture for that. Actually, there was a 9th Street show, sort of exhibition at the Katona Museum in upstate, I think it's upstate New York, and this was in that show. But she talks about this as Aries in her book. And actually, when I bought it as a picture, 1951, called Cedar Bar. And so I was sort of looking through the diary, the 1951 element, and I couldn't find this picture, Cedar Bar. It wasn't in the index. So, and I'd noticed from a 1954 picture that I have by her, still life picture, that she changed the name of it about 4 or 5 times while she was painting it, which is in one of the sort of back bedrooms here. So I thought, well, maybe this was called something else, and then she changed the name to Cedar Bar. So the first picture she talks about, it wasn't hard to find, it's called Aries. And so I was trying to find, a ram in the picture, Aries, the ram in the zodiac. Well, first of all, then you notice that R-A-M, ram, is written in the picture.
Okay. I hadn't noticed that, but yes.
It's anyway, it's crazy, yeah. And then this is clearly a white sort of ram with the face and the horns, like that. And then it's you've got a sort of yellow pentacle, which can be associated with the zodiac in the background that's largely been painted over. And then the sign on the zodiac for Aries is this V, because you have these kind of symbols, if you like. So as well as whether it's Taurus, the bull, Pisces, the fish, Gemini, the twins, whatever, you also have a sort of symbol that represents the sign. And in this case, it's kind of a V that goes like that. So she's painted over in this red here, and clearly that seems to me to be the V. But apart from the fact she's written ram on it, and it's a picture of a ram. So then it's clear that this was Aries.
This was Aries, but now it's Cedar Bar.
So within her journal, she's talking about this painting, Aries, Aries, Aries. And then one day she says in her journal, she's absolutely, she says words to the effect of, I despise the name Aries. I hate the idea of calling a painting by a zodiac sign name, and I'm going to change the name of it. But she doesn't say what to. She changes it to Cedar Bar. So that's kind of the connection. So,
but I wonder why she changed it to Cedar Bar. That's the missing piece.
Well, who knows? She was frequenting the Cedar Bar at the time quite a little bit, so probably something to do with a night out there, maybe.
Interesting. Interesting colors.
Yeah.
An autumn night.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of sort of Joan Mitchell connections here. So we have a Joan Mitchell on the other side of the staircase there. We sort of walked past when we came up. So if we take the view of the Mitchell and then look up at another Michelle Corinne West, Michael West, this is by her as well. Okay. And this is really the emergence of her. This is 1949, and it's called Nihilism. So nihilism obviously means the sort of utter destruction of humanity, and that's obviously reminiscent of the Second World War, right, which had just, which finished just 4 years before this was painted. She's used an unbelievable amount of sort of sand in the collage of this picture, which also makes you think of the word annihilation. It almost looks like a sort of bombs having gone off with, layering of sand, sort of silvery grey, which sort of makes you think of metal in it. And it just looks like a picture of utter destruction. So between the name, it's sort of multimedia and its composition, it's an unbelievably powerful picture. And there was a show of sort of 100 years of female abstraction at the Pompidou Centre last year, which we loaned to. And this work actually didn't go in the show, but they gave it a full-page picture in the catalogue, interestingly. So it's it's an important picture. In terms of how it's painted, aside from the sand and the collage, behind it, it looks like a late 40s Jackson Pollock. She's drip painted the picture as a starting point. Yeah. And then she's created the sand and the collage and the devastation on top of it. So it's a tremendously complex picture underneath it, and a tremendously deep picture, and tremendously interesting, seeing as Janet Sobel is the one that's now tasked with sort of inventing this sort of drip painting technique in the early 40s, and then Jackson Pollock goes to a show of hers, sees that, and then builds on it, and then of course takes it into a whole different sort of level measure, but by a long way. And but I think we know that Jackson Pollock was at that show by Janet Sobel and saw those and commented on them, and then he goes off, and no one's, I don't think, going to stick their neck out and say that he copied her, but it's definitely a drip painting technique, but he does something infinitely larger and more spectacular with it.
I think this opens a door to the whole era of abstractionism. The destruction of World War II then opens the door to paintings where humans weren't the center.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And actually, I own a Janet Sobel, and actually that was one of the pictures that I loaned to the Pompidou Centre last year. She's tremendously important, but the Sobel is not here right now. And actually, I also own Lee Krasner's Prophecy, which is the painting that she was painting when Jackson Pollock died. It's been in over 30 museum shows since 1982. Wow. And actually the Barbican build it as basically her most important picture, and it was a sort of a change of direction for her. And there's a narrative between her and Jackson Pollock when she's painting it about how the painting's going. He's saying it's a great painting, you should definitely finish it. She goes to Paris on a sort of 1 month trip there. He dies in the car crash while she's away, and then there's this famous photograph of her when she's back, and Prophecy is standing on the easel. So, but unfortunately that's not here. It's already en route to the Albertina, ahead of some of the pictures which are being picked up in a few days' time. So we're lacking Frankenthalers that are already out on either that are already either in Austria or they're in Germany, and
we'll have to come back.
Yeah. So another work from Grace Hartigan's journals, 1954. This is called Two Women. It's Daisy Auden on the left, who owned a literary magazine in New York, and her girlfriend Olga Petrov on the right. And they were great friends with Grace Hartigan, and a bit like Elaine de Kooning, not only did she paint pure abstraction, She also painted abstract portraiture on occasion, and actually as we get into the late 60s and beyond, that's pretty much all she does, but not in such a sensitive way as these earlier pictures. So in fact, the painting that MoMA owns, the Persian jacket, is figurative, but it's tremendously abstract. But the painting that the Whitney owns, which is the same date as this, 1954, is very figurative, much the same as this. And but nevertheless, when you look at Daisy Auden's dress here, it's really beautifully abstract and beautifully painted. And a little bit like Elaine de Kooning, the faces are sort of, quite sketchy, but you get a sense of, of the expression. But it's really about the abstraction, their posture, and colour. And it really is a stunning and important work. And she talks about it at length in her diaries, and there's even a photograph of Daisy and Olga sitting together posing for the picture, so which is in her diaries as well.
It's
so
wonderful.
It's the provenance.
Talking about the paintings as well.
Yeah, the provenance is really fantastic.
So are we going into...
Yeah, let's just take a quick look along the corridor.
Yeah.
That's a pretty important picture. It's 1966, and it's called Rufus's Rock. And again, there's a great narrative from Mitchell with this picture. So again, so rare. So at this point, she's living in Paris with Jean-Paul Riopel. It's just before they move out to the countryside. She's been in Paris since about 1959, but they holiday every summer in the south of France around Juan-les-Pins, which is next to Antibes. So she's out sailing one day with a friend of hers, Rufus Zogbaum, and Rufus notices this rock sort of sticking out of the lovely Mediterranean Sea around there, and makes some kind of big deal about this rock. She comes back to the studio and paints 2 pictures of Rufus's rock, Rufus Zogbaum, and this is one of those pictures. So this picture is Rufus's Rock, 1966. And interestingly, I have a painting by Jean-Paul Riopel, 1966, called Antibes, which is in my house in France. And it's a similar colour palette. It's a lot of blue, it's got these little purples in it. So I just wonder if they were standing in the studio next to each other, maybe even using the same paints. So actually, in the book of the Levett Collection, we talk about that, the Riopel painting as well, and really at some point we've got to show them together. But they're different sizes, unfortunately. The Riopel is maybe about 2/3 of the size of this, so they're always going to look like a bit of a mismatch. But nevertheless, it'd be good to get them together at some point.
Yeah, and there's a tiny bit of recollection. Well, this predated the other one.
Yeah, this is earlier.
But there's a little bit of starting. That other painting, the one that recalls the water lilies.
Yeah.
A little bit of starting.
Well, often, sometimes the paintings emerge from the centre of the canvas. I mean, that's not unusual for Mitchell. So you've got these huge areas, super thick impasto in the centre of the canvas here.
Yeah.
And also on the top right, where you've got the background of this sort of mauve purple. Actually, this is by another painting by Perle Fine. This one's a bit later, 1958. It's called Summer One. This was in the Denver Museum of Art exhibition. It's kind of interesting because it's got quite a lot of collage in it. She seems to have used other pieces of canvas, cut them out in sort of almost like Miro type shapes, and then stuck them on the top and then sort of painted over them. And then also it's got these sort of strips of what looks like either very, very thin steel or sort of aluminium that's also sort of embedded in the picture. Yeah, exactly. Another piece here and another little piece up there on the right. So you've got this sort of mass of colour.
Here too.
But there again, but the sort of aluminium effect built into it, and all these sort of Miro-esque type shapes that are cut out and stuck on the top.
But it's less it's less square, less of a lattice.
Oh yeah, this really has nothing to do with Mondrian at this point. This really is just pure abstraction, and maybe she uses the collage to give it another sort of level of sort of light and depth. I mean, this is around the time when the Zero movement is emerging in Italy. So you have Fontana, and then sort of Castellani, Burri is using. Burri's works are really all about collage or different materials,
creating
and it's exploding
dimension.
Plastic and all this kind of thing. Yeah, and making the canvas sculptural. So maybe it's a reference to that as well. Although having said that, Michael Corrine West was using multimedia from the late 40s onwards, but definitely at this point, late 50s, getting into the 60s, you're starting to see a lot of sculptural sort of technique in the way that canvases are being used. So it could also be a sort of relationship with that dynamic as art is changing too. It's a really great picture.
It's beautiful. And
it's on its way to Vienna next week.
It is.
Above a little Louise Bourgeois claw.
Oh, there we go.
We have a beautiful picture by Charlotte Park, another tremendously interesting artist. Showed heavily throughout the 1950s. And a different technique again, these kind of sort of very, very, very thick layers of paint, and then almost like Gerhard Richter-esque, scraped down in some areas, so you see the paint sort of come through. Much earlier than Gerhard Richter, this is 1955, and really is a spectacular picture. And I'm always amazed at how kind of thick the paint is on here. And yet, luckily, over time, it hasn't cracked. So I do worry about this when it goes on tour, because it's going to the Whitechapel Gallery Museum, Fondation Van Gogh.
That's the fragile part of the painting, the impasto.
Exactly. Then it's going to Germany, so I just hope it comes back from all its travel. It's in exactly the same condition as to where it left. Having said that, it's been moving around since 1955, so it's done pretty well so far, so hopefully it's stable. But touch wood, it makes it back. They all make it back okay.
They will.
Yeah.
They will.
And then we're finished with abstract expressionism with two areas here, and then we'll have a quick look at the bedroom and go a little bit more modern just to finish off.
Okay.
So Hans Hofmann was one of the major developers of the movement. So he moved to New York, give or take around 1930. Had moved there from Germany, had this background of German expressionism, so Franz Marc, Kandinsky, Paul Klee, who of course were also abstract artists in their own way. So he set up an art school and started to bring abstraction, of European abstraction at this point, and German expressionism into the New York area. Both,
and he's the top one, no? His work is the top.
So both these were drawn in Hans Hofmann's studio.
Okay.
But they're both by female artists.
Okay.
So the top one is by Lee Krasner and dates to about 1940, and the bottom one is by Mercedes Matter, 1937, who was also a abstract artist throughout the sort of 40s, 50s, and 60s, and did these sort of abstract pictures of largely vases of flowers. Is the series that she's certainly the most known for, and she was great friends with Lee Krasner. In fact, they met because they'd been on a political march together, both arrested and put in the same prison cell. And then,
how lucky.
I think it was Mercedes Matter that introduced Lee Krasner to Hans Hofmann's studio. And the movement is really building, from there. So, so that's those. Actually, another one of the 11 ladies that was in the 9th Street show is a Swiss lady called Sonia Secular. This is a 1948 picture by her called 7 a.m. And it's basically a New York cityscape picture. This seems to be one of the bridges on the right down here, and you can see the various sort of buildings and towers. Spectacular picture by her. She was in the 9th Street show. She showed with Peggy Guggenheim Gallery, the Art of the Century Gallery that was Peggy Guggenheim's gallery that closed in 1947, and then she moves back to Europe after the war when Europe sort of becomes safer again. And then, of course, she develops the Peggy Guggenheim Foundation and collection in Venice shortly after that. But Sonia Secular was one of her major artists, and then after Peggy Guggenheim, I think she shows with Betty Parsons, I think, but then she goes to another gallery. But unfortunately, she suffered from very, very serious depression issues, and having lived for a long time in New York, moves back to Switzerland around 1960, and unfortunately commits suicide in 1961. Although there was a number of artists at the period, of course, that committed suicide. It's just a beautiful, beautiful work by her. So even though it's sort of essentially a grey picture with sort of the black, lines sort of abstractly outlining the city, the little touches of yellow and blue and green and sort of turquoisey just really just make it explode. It's really an amazing, amazing picture. So
it does speak a lot about New York.
It really does. It's a perfect cityscape at 7 a.m. So it's a good name. And then we won't go around the back, otherwise we're literally going to be here for a year.
We can't go around the back, but we can go around the front.
But we can go around the front. I think we're finished in the bedroom, and just watch the step here, Francesco. But I absolutely love Tracey Emin. Been lucky enough to get to know her personally as well in recent years a little bit, and from around, let's say, 2012 to 2015. She does a series of pretty large-scale tapestries, of which this is one. But it's actually one of my favourite works by her. So sticking with the Tracey Emin theme, after George Michael died, he had a sale of his works at Christie's, and he had a really, really important collection of contemporary British artists. And in the evening sale, there was two amazing works that he owned by Tracey Emin. One painting called Hartigan, which I bought, which is actually going out on loan. That's away at the moment. So that's going to an exhibition actually here in Florence, the Palazzo Medici Riccardi. And this blanket from her famous blanket series from sort of the beginning of the 2000s. And so unbelievable provenance, the name drunk to the bottom of my soul. And, of course, one of Tracey Emin's incredible sort of pieces of writing or poetry on it as well. Tremendously moving. And, you've got sort of Tracey Emin, one of the greatest artistic talents of our lifetime. And this was owned by one of the greatest sort of singers and musical talents of our lifetime. So what could be better than the double whammy of artists for a provenance of this picture? So, and it's a similar colour to the walls. You've got sort of the pink and the red, and a blanket. Where would you hang a blanket? The bedroom.
There it is.
So it really is to wake up and see that every morning. Really is something special. Then over here, staying on the theme of Tracey Emin. So we've seen a tapestry, a blanket, and actually, as I mentioned earlier, in recent years, Tracey Emin's been doing mostly painting and sculpture, and I absolutely love her paintings. So this is, I think, the most recent work in the house. It's 2019. Wow. And it was in a show that she had with her gallery that represents in Italy here, Lorcan O'Neill in Rome, and it's, as you can see, a nude. And of course, Tracy Emin is connected a lot with Sheila in the way that she sort of draws and uses the line. So, however, I personally see a bit of Henry Moore in this picture. Right. And of course, we know the Henry Moore sculptures, they're quite sort of rounded. You often have sort of this kind of sort of pose. Mm-hmm. And for some reason, maybe it's just me, I resonate sort of with this picture with regard to Henry Moore.
Right.
So, and, it's a very kind of soft, beautiful work and great composition. And her paintings really are just fantastic. So
she's doing a little bit of layering too, as we saw.
Exactly. So again, tremendous depth to the picture, as there always is with or often is with Tracy.
Francesco, if you would actually get the whole bedroom, I don't know if you've managed so far, just so that our guests can have a look, and then we'll reach our last painting of the day, which is quite a statement, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, we're finished on another abstract artist that paints figurative abstract pictures. This is a 2004 work by Cecily Brown. Of course, the British artist, moved to New York in the late 90s and has painted from there ever since. She's a similar age to me, I think, within about a year or two. And her early works in particular, I just find absolutely blockbuster. We've talked extensively about, the importance of composition, the importance of colour, the importance of work in the painting, layering, and my goodness, do you see it in this? Millions of colours, layer upon layer upon layer upon background of paints. I mean, how you get from this sort of red, which seems to be the furthest in the background here, to these whites and yellows, and then all this mass is going on top of that. And then, you have these beautiful flowers coming out, that's sort of the almost tangerine-coloured leaves, and it's really just the foliage at the bottom of the picture is astounding. And if it wasn't on such a palazzo-sized wall, you probably wouldn't even gravitate to that so much if the painting was shown much lower. But even in these areas here, you really see the absolute genius of Cecily Brown's painting, which of course she's become, so famous for.
But even the figures, even the figures are beautiful.
Yeah, exactly. And often there's more than two figures in one of her paintings, not always. But this one's called Couple. And sometimes there's a play on old masters in her pictures, of course. Mm-hmm. And this one's clearly a play on Sir Francis Bacon, the way that the faces are painted, the colours, and the way that the colour merges is clearly highly Bacon-esque.
So, Christian, this painting is going to Florence. It's going to be exhibited here in Florence.
The idea is to do an exhibition of the modern-day collectors of Florence. Wow. So I'm loaning 5 works from my collection to that, of which this is one. So this is coming off the bedroom wall in a few days' time, and going to the Renaissance Palace, the Medici Palace of the Riccardi. And so I'm learning Cecily Brown, George Michael's Hurricane painting by Tracy Emin. I'm also loaning a large and important 1983 Bridget Riley. I'm also loaning an Elaine de Kooning and from her cave painting series. And I'm also loaning the Louise Bourgeois Nest of 5 sculpture that we saw in the Chocolate Room.
Christian, it's been a pleasure, as usual, to speak with you and to experience your wonderful collection. a long show, but then who can resist? Who can resist these beautiful
once we get into
works?
talking about these pictures,
Yeah.
it just it's hard to stop.
It's there's really so much to say and so many layers. We've seen painterly layers, but there are also layers within society and relationships with these artists, with each other and with their partners, etc. That has been such a pleasure to explore with you. And thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. Really, it's an impressive collection, and it's an impressive, how would we say, sentiment that you share of your interest for these works, for these women artists in particular. And
well, thank you very much again for asking me to do it. So it's a privilege, and I'm happy that other people are interested in seeing the work. Yeah. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.